All right, so this is the detail video of everything from the front to the back. Starting up front here, we have the 75-inch Duke propeller for the STOL airplane. We set it initially at 20 inches, 20 to 22, depending on what RPM we want. Maybe we'll set this one to 21. Bolts gets tightened to 200 inch-pounds. Same with all the hardware on this propeller. Spinner bulkhead is behind it. And behind that, we have the propeller extension. Propeller extension is a little bit longer. It's a 3-inch on the 750 with the 150 horsepower engine. And the reason for that is the engine mount is shorter, slightly bigger engine. Move the engine back, use a little bit longer prop extension, you use the same cowling and get some weight aft. Gearbox is mounted on the engine, obviously. And then we're looking at the things that we installed during the install. We've got a gearbox probe. The gearbox probe, in this case, of course this varies, this just happens to be a yellow wire with a red stripe. Coolant, blue wire with a white stripe. And we have the Dynon sensor for the oil pressure, and it always has 3 different color wires, black, green, and red, and we run those into the airplane as well. We're going to look at those as we get inside the cockpit area. We installed the breather overflow or breather tube, and we have it pointed but not touching the exhaust pipe. We have our heater hose, hot coolant coming out of the front of the engine, and it's going into the heater through a grommet in the firewall back here. We also have a return hose for the heater, and it goes to the thermostat, not a thermostat, the coolant housing back here where the coolant pump is located. We use the 12-inch remote oil pressure transducer kit from Viking. We put an adapter into the engine and we remote mount the transducer for longer life. Exhaust system is already done. We tighten everything to 200 to 220 inch-pounds on those nuts. We installed the swivel support clamp down here, this little link here, and this 10mm bolt, and this where we could adjust the length out here, put a clamp around here, and fasten that down. That keeps it from vibrating. And we have a hole in the cowling cut for the exhaust. We fill the engine with 1 gallon of 0W20 synthetic Mobil 1 oil. And we check that that's good. It's so clean you can barely see it. These are the coils, 1 for each cylinder, of course. Our oil filter is in place, and the oil, like we said, is in the engine. This part will swivel a little bit, just so that people know. It's in O-rings, the way it's mounted into the engine. We have a 90 and a 45. We have a permanent clamp, and a removable clamp, just to be able to install, remove hoses easier. There's also a clip here that can be pushed, and this can be undone as far as draining the radiator if needed with a big bucket underneath. We have the hose for the gearbox breather back here, and it runs on this engine a little bit differently. We decided not to run it all the way to the firewall. Right here's the hose, and we had a spot right here. We tied the bottle here, and we tied it here, and the hose comes up right here. We did drill an extra hole in the cap so it can vent even easier. Usually this bottle vents along the threads, and it vents through this rubber orifice and then down along the threads. To get a little bit easier venting, we also drilled on the opposite side a hole on the top of the cap. This is not a gearbox fill bottle. This is a vent bottle. It just, when the air gearbox heats up, and the 10 ounces of gear oil that's in there, which is Mobil 175 W90, when it expands, the fumes will go up through this hose and into that bottle. Everything up front here is all complete. As far as what we had to do on the install, route these wires for the sensors, install the fuel hose. We have a quick disconnect right here. Push those gray tabs and it'll come off. And we have a fuel hose that runs the entire length all the way through the cockpit and all the way back to the back of the airplane. Then we go into the filter, and then we have the red cube for fuel flow, and then we go up here and we go into the header tank area with that hose. Back onto the engine, we install the air filter. We did play around a little bit with the angle of this bracket. Never bend on this bracket when it's attached to the throttle body. If you want to flex it or bend it a little bit one way or the other, remove these screws, pre-bend it and put it back on. And we had to do that a little bit so that we could navigate in between the engine mounting tube and the coolant overflow hose, which is another thing we did. We installed this tank. This is the coolant overflow, has a tiny little hole on top as well for venting. And that hose comes from right in front of the thermostat right here. The thermostat sits right in here, in this split right here. We did install a quick drain on this engine. Customer wanted one. We installed the hoses for the radiator on this side. Here's your alternator. Here's your alternator power lead, which needs to be strain relieved as soon as it moves away from the alternator, which it is right there. This is the support for the intake manifold. Starter motor. The starter can be removed in place. It's a little bit tricky if you ever had to. You have to take this bolt and you can get in there with a box wrench with an offset to hold that, or you can run an extension all the way from the firewall behind the intake manifold to get to that. Those are 3/4 and this is 14 here. The engine mount was done early. We have the rubber donuts, large washer, small washer, nut, large washer, and the bolt running through from the back. We did the firewall mounts right here. The 150 engines, until we run out of these mounts, we'll have these steel plated spacers between the mount and the firewall. There were 10 mounts made that way. There's like no problem with that, to have a little bit of a spacer, but the mount ended up being just a little bit too close to the firewall to have proper clearance right up in here. So we put the spacers in. We could have just scalloped out a little bit of aluminum here, but rather than doing that, we decided between the spacers and the different length bolts and the right prop extension, everything ended up perfect as far as the offset, the distance from the firewall, so forth and so on. So if you have a 150, and you have a 750 with the top tubes, for a while until we run out of those mounts, you'll have just this little steel spacer behind here to put it right in the proper location. We have everything that runs through the firewall pass-through. We install the firewall pass-through, the fuel hose, the ECU bundle. And we have one more thing, which is the bundles of the wires for the sensors that we installed on the engine. We have the power lead to the starter right here. Make sure it gets tied up against the intake there so it doesn't chafe on any sharp objects here. That's a cable, 12-volt cable with a lot of amperage. And it then leaves the engine right here and goes over to the power pass-through of the Firewall and then to the battery bank or contactors behind the Firewall. We already have the ground cables installed. There's two of them, one here and one here. They're attached to the bottom on a second nut of the right there. All right, so we double nutted that and put a flexible ground strap, it's called, here, and one back there. They go onto the ground lug, which goes through the Firewall, and then from there to the batteries. Actually, they go to the negative ground bus, and then two cables go from there to each individual batteries. Both batteries are on for starting, so we can use 10-gauge cables to the grounding strap, and then at that point we can go to a larger cable because each battery feeds that ground bus by itself, and we have them both on when we crank the engine, which gives us enough battery cable size to do that. We installed the steel bungee. It's been tightened enough with spacers. We put some spacers on so we wouldn't have to thread the nuts down so far. And that's enough to hold the steering rod up in the V-block, which means it's holding the engine up in the suspension, and it has enough force to do that, and that's a good starting point for that. Other than that, let's go inside or behind the Firewall, and also behind the instrument panel, which way you look at it. And here we have the batteries mounted. Each battery is grounded separately. Each battery has a cable to each individual contactor. Each contactor has the diode on it to prevent spikes, that's shown in our wire diagram. Then at the output of the contactor, they're tied together, so when both are closed, we can feed power to the starter motor. And we can also feed power to the rest of the airplane. Everything on this bus right here is just for the engine. You never should have anything else on this. It feeds the ECU through these wires right here, and it feeds the switch panel to turn on pumps and alternator and all that kind of stuff. Feeds the power right there to this switch panel down here. Now there's a 30 amp fuse, which is located right here, over to this other bus. And from this bus, we can do anything we want. As far as from here on, you can wire your entire airplane, and you have 30 amps to work with right there. Now, the layout of these two junction blocks, let's run through those. We basically have a setup here and a setup here. Let's go to the other side and look at the colors of those wires. Again, this is arbitrary. This is just wire that I took from the back, different color wires to do this particular airplane, but the system is the same, or the idea is the same. So we've got over here the starter relay. So we got that wired in, and this wire then runs to the starter motor, and that was part of the ECU bundle, the wires that came in from the engine in the ECU bundle. And then we move over from there, and it says coolant, and that wire, we're going to add here a wire to the dynon to measure coolant temperature of the engine. We're moving down here, and you got oil, so that's oil pressure right there. And there's oil, and there's oil. So those are all the three wires we saw for the oil pressure transducer. And they also go to the dynon to read oil pressure. And we got G box or gearbox right here, which means the yellow one with the red stripe that we saw out there gets wired from here to the dynon input to measure gearbox temperature. And as we move back down or along here, we have TAC. So this wire came from the ECU bundle. The ECU provides the TAC signal to here. We've provided 12 volts here through a 1K resistor. So we have just power from here to here with a 1K resistor. So we have now put power onto this wire through the 1K, and we're going to double up over here. And we're going to put the TAC wire that goes to the dynon, and we're going to put 1 rev per one pulse per rev in the dynon to read the right RPM. And then as we move down here, we have ALT or alternator that came in from the engine, and we are already wired that with this yellow wire, which goes over to our alternator switch right here. And then when we throw that, we put 12 volts onto the alternator field, and we engage the alternator. Sometimes the engine will start easier with the alternator on, sometimes with it off, so you can try both of those. And then we go from there, and we have fuel tank. So we got this one and this one where it says fuel tank. Those are wires from the fuel tank sender, meaning the header tank sender unit. So that's going to go to the dynon for your third fuel gauge for your sender unit. And that's 3.5 gallons in this installation, in this airplane. And then we have fuel pressure, which comes from the pressure transducer from the dynon, and it's also located in the back there on the tank. We'll take a look at that. And those are this wire and this wire. That's for the fuel pressure transducer going to the dynon. Over here, this, by the way, is the starter relay right there that engages the starter. We have all the ground wires going here. We have a fatter one that goes all the way to the back of the plane there to a grounding bus, and that allows us to ground everything in the back. And then we have grounds for a whole variety of other things. Like 2 of them come from these contactor switches, because they have to when you throw one of this switch, this one or this one, then basically you're putting ground to these terminals right here. So it goes from here to the switch to here, and that'll close that contactor like this. And the same with the other one. And that's how you engage the contactor. So 2 of these grounds are that. One goes to the back, and then there's grounds for other things here. And the main ground then is this one going up to the firewall, which then goes to the engine block, and it's only used to this one and the one over there for the positive. The only time that ever becomes energized is or draws a lot of current would be when you engage the starter motor. We mounted the ECU, which the bundle for the ECU comes in from the engine, and then the ECU itself is mounted right here. We plug in the connectors, make sure they snap in and lock, and we take any excess cabling and we tie it up and get rid of it in a nice manner so it doesn't get too complicated. We did install a throttle. We're going to move that, actually, consulting with the builder. This is going to have dual controls, which means the throttle is not going to go here in the center. So we're going to move that. Now, moving further along, we have a switch panel, which now has power before the 30 amp fuse back here. So we have this power lead right there. This one, yellowish with purple stripe. That powers all of this. And then each individual, think here, like your battery, alternator, fuel pump, and auxiliary, which is not used for anything right now. It can be used for anything less than 5 amps, hopefully engine related, maybe like an engine monitor or a gauge or something like that. And then the heater control right there, the starter key switch, with a spare key hanging here, and a 25 amp breaker for the starter, to engage the starter. We have lots of spare wires that are hanging right here. Put in a whole bunch of like extra wires running all the way to the back in the airplane, just to be able to have access for the builder to do the flap motor and whatever is back there. So these are all extra. And then we have the primary ones that we used for fuel gauge back there, the fuel pumps and all that kind of stuff. On the back side of here, that just shows you the setup that is pictured on our wire diagram, and also some pictures of our wiring module that's on our store at the website, on the website. Now let's follow some of these wires as they go to the back. There's always, up through the years, working on these airplanes, like what do? We run stuff underneath the airplane? Do we run it through the tunnel? Whatever. Okay, the decision that has been made now the last few years is that we don't want to run it underneath the airplane, because it just gets harder to work on it and find it, and it has to run up above the radiator and all that, even though there's a little channel underneath there, and it's possible to do that. We also don't want to run it in a tunnel, because when this is all done, there's rudder cables in here, there's a torque tube in here, there's a stick in here, and I don't even know how much stuff is going to be in there with the dual controls and everything. But we don't want sensitive systems like fuel lines and cables and wires and stuff inside here, hidden away, and possibly chafing and possibly getting touched by the controls and all that. And other than that, there's just not a lot of places to run anything. So the decision has been made to just run them inside the console. Of course, this is a console, and this one's not cut the way the console is. This is just stuck in there because we're just doing a panel that the customer will then cut, and then it will be made into the Zenith console with the side plates and all that kind of stuff. But we run the fuel line totally unbroken, no cuts in it, it's just a continuous piece all the way from the back of the airplane all the way to the engine. So, and it's protected. And we run the wires the same. Now, some people say, well, you can't mix fuel and all that. Well, like I said, there's no connections. There's no way for fuel to get on the wires or anything like that. And that just happens to be in some areas. Once we go through the bulkheads, we use separate grommets for fuel and separate grommets for the wires. So what has to happen then is that right in this area right here, and once you put the side panels on, you have to make a slot so that you can come over this and fit that in. And the same out here with your floor panels and your carpet. You have to cover that with a piece of carpet. But it's only being shown like this in this one little area right here. And that allows us for a nice clean installation with grommets the whole way. So we got grommets here. We got grommets in the second bulkhead right there. We've got grommets here in the third bulkhead. And we have a little bit of loom on the hose wherever it touches anything. We've got grommets in the bottom back of the seat. And we have a little extra hose here just to have in case you ever needed to cut an end off the filter and reinstall it. So you have a little bit of a service loop right there. And then we have the wires going parallel to the fuel system to wherever it goes. All right. Here's the fuel filter with quick disconnects for the high pressure side. So you can quickly change the filter through the opening here from the bottom during servicing. We have the fuel cube, the red cube, in line. And we have straight in and straight out on that, so it can read nice and accurate. And we have that elevated a little bit so that we can clear sharp edges in the structure of the airplane here. And then we get into the back, which is the header tank area. And we're going to take a look at that, but after we go back forward and take a look at our heater. And the heater, we basically put a couple of grommets in the Firewall, And then we install the heater with a couple of bolts through our top shelf here. It threads right into the heater. We did put some hoses on the bolts right there. And that just enables us, those are just spacers, and also a little bit of cushioning for the heater as it's mounted there. Between those, and then of course we don't use the plug that comes with, or that we could have been able to obtain for the heater, because we use basically just fast on terminals with aviation grade wire and aviation terminals, and there's 4 of them, and we just stick them into the connector individually like that. And then that harness goes to the back of the heater switch, which is right here, and then the ground and the power goes where they go, up on top here. And then that is all that's needed to be able to have a 5-position or 4-position heater switch, including the off position. Here again, you can see the ECU being mounted with the ECU connectors. This particular ECU for the 150 doesn't have a mount, so you have to make a little box, or we used Right Stuff and bonded a plate to the back of it, and then we use that to tie it and kind of suspend it from the tray up above it. That's the heater. Now, let's go back and take a look at what's going on in the back here. Maybe we can see some of it getting a little bit darker later in the day. We do have the drain installed. We've used a grommet for that and an oversized hole. You don't want too small of a hole, because if the tank ever moves, you don't want it to, break off or bend the drain. And we do use a drain that's, you can lock it open. And that way, if you ever wanted to drain the whole airplane, put a big bucket underneath here, or a funnel and some gas cans, and you can open it and it'll just keep draining. We also have some spare wires right here, so we left those there. You can use a terminal strip anywhere in the back here. Wire some of those to that, can wire this to that, and then that'll take, these 3 wires go up front then, because these wires go up front. And you can also use these for flap motors and anything else that's back here. Now, we ran this bundle of wires up here. We did not run it on the side here because there's going to be cables running into the tail section. We protected the fuel hose, and we ran him behind here and up through, and then it goes to the area back here. And basically all of this, it's hard to see now when it's dark, but all of this is shown in our fuel system video. And it's basically a pump here and a pump here, fuel sender here. You have your inlet filter and your inlet filter from the other tank, and then you have a vent hose from one tank and a vent hose to the other tank. And all those hoses are just hanging here ready to be installed. And the grommets are right here ready to go through these bulkheads that it's going to take the hose there. I actually kind of like now to, rather than drilling all the way up in the corner here and go back like that, I've found that you're going to have a much better fuel flow in these airplanes for level flight to be able to drain the wing tanks completely if you come down at an angle. So, and then through the bulkhead and then down to the tank. That brings it in front of the back window, but there's nobody's, doesn't hurt anything. You can put a nice pretty piece of like tubing or conduit and paint it black or whatever you got to do. But coming in at an angle like that does make for a better fuel flow than if you were to go all the way back like that and then down. Then at some attitudes when the tanks are almost empty, you might not get every gallon out of the airplane main tanks. And then of course we have we've started to use a return. We call it a return. It's not really a return, but it's a bleed off of this fuel block back to the tank here. We kind of do it on all engines now, if it's direct injected or not. That just bleeds the fuel pressure in all the hoses that run in the whole airplane up to the engine. After you shut it off, the pressure slowly bleeds to zero. Then there's no pressure on anything when you're parking the airplane. And there's a little orifice that does that, and it's screwed into this block here. You'll see that in detail. And then there's, you know, terminal strip here, and then there's a grounding bus here for all the grounds, the pump grounds, the ground for the well, there are other grounds. For instance, the transducer here, and there's the pressure transducer I talked about at Dynon. So all this is now done as far as mounting this. This cross brace goes in. Like from this point here down to the floor, following that, it's almost exactly 12 inches, just as a reference point to make it easier for you. And these flanges have to face aft and towards the tail section. A couple of bolts here. Looks like one hole down worked out for me as far as the angle of the tank. And of course the angle of the tank should be, with the smart level, the same as the ceiling, because that's what flies level when you're flying. So pretty close. It doesn't have to be perfect. But and then we put a piece of wood in here. This will be replaced obviously with the back bulkhead when you're ready. And then these two screws right here would then go through that bulkhead, and you would see in the baggage compartment, you would see a screw here and a screw here to hold the front of this tank. All right, that is it for the installation of the 150 engine in the 750 airframe. Here's some spare wire. The customer can have that. And I also want to kind of like mention something that is unique with this installation, and we've done a lot of them, but if you look at it, it's such a visible view of the Viking system in an airplane. You basically, like, you have the engine, you have the battery tray, you have the switches to turn things on and off, and you have a header tank or a fuel system that collects everything. And a lot of builders, right on that back wall there on the other side, they'll put a little panel that can be opened up. And then you have full access for pre-flight to the fuel tank. And not just your fuel tank, your entire fuel system, your filters, your pumps, your connectors, your transducer, and your wiring for the fuel system. Everything is right there. The only thing that you would have to open the bottom cover for will be when you do your condition inspection. You know, you want to go in there and change this filter for the... But keep in mind, this filter, you change that very, very seldom. That one really can't get much dirt in it because you got pre-filters prior to that going into the header tank. Now take these filters, these are automotive filters, and out of hundreds and hundreds that we've used, or if not thousands, we've had one now that had a loose element in it. So just while I'm thinking about it, before you put them in, just shake the filter to make sure that the element inside is properly bonded to the casing internally. That's just a check that you do on the filter prior to installing it. But like I said, it's kind of a neat thing to almost like zoom out here and see the whole system as a unit rather than having to zoom in on each one. Because the back bulkhead is not in this airplane, we have the luxury of seeing everything in one view, like right there. All right, now we're going to take it outside and run it.